What if the key to unraveling a $100 million fraud wasn't buried in a complex ledger or a hidden line of code, but in the faint, ghostly reflection in a dead man's eyeglasses from a photograph taken 70 years ago? What if the only person sharp enough to see it wasn't a forensic accountant or a high-priced lawyer, but a 24-year-old waitress, exhausted and invisible, serving them their final celebratory dinner? This is the story of Arthur Sterling, an aging lion of industry, a man who built his empire with his bare hands and was about to cement his legacy. And it is the story of Amelia Russo, the young woman who cleared his table. In a room filled with supposed experts paid to protect him, she noticed a flicker of light, a distortion in an old photo that everyone else had dismissed as a flaw in the print. That tiny detail would expose a devastating betrayal, save a noble dream from being corrupted, and prove that sometimes the most important truth is seen not by the powerful, but by those who have learned to truly look. Prepare yourself, because you will not believe how one quiet act of courage in the face of absolute contempt changed everything. The air inside the Pinnacle was different. It wasn't just filtered, it was curated, scrubbed of the city's grime, and infused with the subtle, intoxicating perfume of old money and new ambition. It smelled of seared scallops, aged leather, and the quiet desperation of men and women playing for stakes Mia Russo could barely comprehend. For Mia, it was the smell of the gilded cage she entered 5 nights a week. At 24, her life was a ledger of mounting debts and deferred dreams, each entry written in the fine script of her grandfather's escalating medical bills. 4 years ago, she'd been the star of her university's archival studies program, a prodigy with an uncanny eye for the stories hidden in faded photographs and forgotten documents. She had a full scholarship and a future that seemed as bright and clear as the flashbulb on a vintage speed graphic camera. Then her grandfather Marco, the master carpenter who had raised her, suffered a series of debilitating strokes. The man whose hands could coax poetry from wood could no longer hold a spoon. His savings, meticulously accrued over 50 years of honest labor, evaporated in a maelstrom of specialists, therapies, and medications that insurance only partially covered. Mia had traded her scholarship and her dreams for a sommelier's corkscrew in a crisp black uniform that felt more like a shroud. Every evening she moved through the Pinnacle like a phantom, her smile a masterfully crafted piece of neutral courtesy. The uniform was her armor, but her shoes were the tell. Sensible, black, and practical, their insoles were compressed into unforgiving thinness, a constant, aching testament to the miles she paced between the gleaming kitchen and the tables of New York's elite. She served people who would spend her grandfather's monthly care costs on a single bottle of Screaming Eagle Cabernet and never once consider the transaction. Tonight, the gravitational center of the restaurant, and perhaps the entire financial district, was Table 7. It was the prime corner booth, a secluded alcove of dark wood and plush velvet, permanently reserved for Arthur Sterling. His name was not just whispered in rooms like this, it was forged into the very bones of the city. Sterling was a titan from a bygone era, a self-made billionaire who had built a construction empire on grit, vision, and a reputation for unshakable integrity. He wasn't like the flashy tech billionaires or the rapacious hedge fund managers. He was an architect of the tangible world, a man who saw value in bedrock and steel, with pale blue eyes that held the hard-won wisdom of a man who had seen it all. Or so he believed. Mia knew of him, of course. It was impossible to live in New York and not see the Sterling name on cranes and construction sites. His current project, however, was different. It wasn't another skyscraper to scrape the heavens. It was the Sterling Center for Neurological Advancement, a state-of-the-art research facility he was building in honor of his late wife, Eleanor, who had been stolen from him by the slow, cruel thief of Alzheimer's disease. This wasn't about profit, it was his penance, his tribute, the final, most important structure of his life. Tonight, he was not alone. At his right sat Vincent Thorne, his protege. Thorne was everything Sterling was not. Young, impeccably smooth, with a Harvard MBA, and a smile that could charm a snake out of its skin. Sterling had found him 10 years ago, a brilliant, hungry kid from the wrong side of the tracks, and had molded him, trusted him, loved him like the son he'd never had. Now, as the CEO of Sterling Enterprises, Thorne was the public face of the empire, the heir apparent. Opposite them sat two lawyers from the white shoe firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, their faces etched with the smug satisfaction of a deal well done. The tension at the table was a low hum, an electric current of triumph that made the crystal glasses vibrate. Mia's job was to be an absence, a silent functionary who replenished water and removed plates. But she was a born observer, and as she performed the ritual of serving their amuse-bouche, she couldn't help but absorb the fragments of their conversation. "The final trust transfer is scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow," one of the lawyers said, his voice a confident baritone. "The land acquisition is complete. The seller's holding company, Viridian Assets, has signed off on everything. It's irrevocable." "Arthur, you've done it," Vincent said, his voice rich with practiced sincerity. He placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. "Eleanor would be so proud. You've secured the perfect site. The history, the location, it's poetic." Arthur Sterling simply nodded, a flicker of profound sadness in his eyes. "It's for her," he murmured. "It all has to be perfect." Vincent gestured to a large leather-bound portfolio on the table. "And it is. The due diligence is flawless. We have the complete history of the property, right back to the original owner." The men opened the portfolio. Inside were pristine, high-resolution copies of deeds, site plans, and historical documents. But what drew Mia's eye for just a fraction of a second were the photographs. They were beautiful reproductions of old black and white images, showing the site as it was in the 1950s, a small, family-owned manufacturing plant. Mia refilled Sterling's water, her movements economical and silent. As she leaned in, her gaze lingered on a large photo of the original owner, a man named Joseph Moretti, standing proudly in front of his factory in 1956. It was a professionally shot photograph, the kind of corporate portraiture meant to convey stability and pride. Moretti was a stout man in a dark suit, his face serious, his hands clasped behind his back. For a fleeting moment, the archivist in Mia, the student she used to be, stirred from her slumber. It was a well-composed shot, good lighting, sharp focus. She saw the familiar grid of the city behind him, the faint outline of a vintage Chevrolet parked at the curb. Then she pulled back, melting into the background. It was just a table, just another group of powerful men shaping the world, while she was mentally calculating if this table's tip would cover the new prescription for Marco. She had no inkling that the dormant skill within her was about to collide with a devastating lie. The dinner continued, a symphony of expensive tastes. Courses arrived and vanished. Wine was swirled, sniffed, and approved with a curt nod from Vincent. The conversation was a triumphant murmur of nine-figure sums, construction timelines, and the self-congratulatory talk of men who had just won. Mia moved on autopilot, her body executing the familiar choreography of service, while her mind drifted to her small apartment in Queens. She thought of Marco sitting in his armchair, his once powerful hands resting uselessly in his lap, his eyes full of a frustration she felt in her own soul. He had taught her everything she knew about integrity. "Look at the grain of the wood, Mia," he used to say in his workshop, the air thick with the scent of sawdust and shellac. "The truth of the tree is right there, if you know how to look. People are the same. Look past the polish. Look at the grain." It happened as she was clearing the plates for the main course, a dry-aged porterhouse that cost more than her weekly groceries. The portfolio was still open. Arthur Sterling was staring at the photo of Joseph Moretti again, a nostalgic, wistful look on his face. "A family man," Sterling said quietly. "Built it from nothing, just like I did. He sold it in '58, moved his family to Florida. I like that our foundation, our tribute to my family, will be built on land that was once home to another man's dream." "A beautiful sentiment, Arthur," Vincent cooed, his smile never faltering. As Mia reached for Vincent's plate, her eyes were drawn back to the photograph of Moretti. This time she wasn't just glancing. Her focus, honed by years of studying micro-details and historical images, snagged on something insignificant, something impossible, something wrong. It was in Moretti's eyeglasses. They were thick, black-rimmed spectacles, fashionable for the era. The photographer had been skilled, avoiding any direct flash glare on the lenses. But there was a reflection. In the soft ambient light of the 1956 afternoon, the convex lens of Moretti's left eyeglass had caught a faint, distorted reflection of what was in front of him. Mia froze, her hand hovering over the plate. Her heart began a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. It was a ghost in the glass, a tiny, warped image of a man standing just out of the camera's frame. The man was holding a document, and on his hand, clearly visible even in its miniature, distorted form, was a ring, a signet ring with a distinctive crest, a coiled serpent biting its own tail, the Ouroboros. A memory, sharp and sickening, pierced through her exhaustion. Last year, while researching a paper on New York's old crime families for a history elective, she had spent weeks digging through digital newspaper archives. She'd become obsessed with the Falcone crime family, a ruthless syndicate that had preyed on small business owners in the 1950s through extortion and loan sharking. Their leader, Antonio the Serpent Falcone, was notorious for his vanity and his custom-made Ouroboros signet ring. There were dozens of press photos of him, and the ring was always there, a symbol of his brutal, unending power. It couldn't be. Sterling's lawyers, this world-class firm, had supposedly done months of deep-dive due diligence. They had certified that Joseph Moretti had sold his land willingly and cleanly to a legitimate development company in 1958. But the ghostly reflection in his glasses told a different story. It suggested that as this proud photo was being taken, a man wearing the ring of a notorious mob boss was standing right in front of him, holding a piece of paper. The expression on Moretti's face, which at first looked like pride, now looked like something else entirely. Fear. Resignation. The look of a man signing away his life's work under duress. She straightened up, the heavy plate in her hand forgotten. She looked at the men at the table. Vincent was laughing at a joke one of the lawyers made. Arthur Sterling was lost in a reverie about his late wife. They were looking at the portfolio as a symbol of their victory. They weren't seeing the grain of the wood. Their eyes, trained on spreadsheets and contracts, were blind to the faint, 70-year-old whisper of a crime. Mia backed away, her mind a chaotic storm. What could she possibly do? Nothing. Say nothing. That was the sane choice. She was a waitress. Interrupting this meeting to talk about a reflection in a photograph would be career suicide. They would think she was insane. She would be fired, blacklisted, a laughingstock. The sheer audacity of it, a server challenging a narrative solidified by a team from Sullivan and Cromwell. She walked toward the kitchen, her legs feeling like they were wading through cement, but Marco's voice echoed in her head. Look at the grain, Mia. The truth is always there. She knew what this could mean. If the land had been originally acquired through coercion and mob connections, the chain of title, the legal history of the property, could be tainted. The company that sold it to Sterling, Viridian Assets, could be a shell corporation set up to launder a property with a dirty history. At best, it would be a legal nightmare, spawning lawsuits from Moretti's descendants. At worst, it was an elaborate fraud. The look on Arthur Sterling's face flashed in her mind, the raw grief when he spoke of his wife. This foundation was sacred to him, and it felt wrong. It felt like a trap, a detail so perfectly hidden in plain sight that only someone with an obsessive eye, or someone who knew exactly what ghost to look for, would ever find it. Mia stood at the kitchen's threshold, the heat and clatter washing over her. She looked back at table 7. She could disappear, finish her shift, go home to her grandfather. In 12 hours, Arthur Sterling's tribute to his wife would be built on a foundation of lies, and she would be polishing silverware for the lunch rush. Or she could risk everything, her job, her dignity, what little stability she had, on a ghost in a pair of eyeglasses. It felt like standing on the edge of one of Sterling's own skyscrapers, the wind howling around her, with a single terrifying step to take into the abyss. For 10 minutes that felt like 10 years, Mia was suspended in a state of agonizing indecision. She operated on muscle memory, clearing a neighboring table, delivering a round of after-dinner cognacs, her mind a battlefield. Every rational instinct screamed at her to remain invisible. She was a nobody, a ghost in a service uniform. These men were kings, insulated by layers of wealth and power so thick they were practically in a different atmosphere. To them, she was furniture that breathed. But the image of that ring, the coiled serpent in the glass, was seared into her consciousness. It was more than just a historical curiosity. It was a matter of right and wrong. It was about the truth that her grandfather had instilled in her as a core value. To see it and say nothing felt like a betrayal of him, of the person she was raised to be. She glanced over at Arthur Sterling. He had his reading glasses on now, peering at a document one of the lawyers had passed him. He looked tired, the immense weight of his empire and his grief pressing down on him. He looked like a man surrounded by loyal soldiers, yet completely alone in his watchtower. Damn it. Taking a deep, trembling breath, she smoothed the front of her uniform. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner. She picked up a polished silver coffee pot from a service station. Her hand was shaking so badly she could see the dark liquid shiver. The pot was her excuse, her passport to approach the table one last time. She walked toward them. The plush carpet seemed to suck at her feet, trying to hold her back. As she drew near, Vincent Thorne was speaking, his voice a silken balm of reassurance. So it's done. Tomorrow morning the Sterling Center is no longer a dream. Viridian was tough, but they were clean. Every I dotted, every T crossed. Your legacy is secure, Arthur. Sterling still looked troubled, a deep furrow in his brow. I have a feeling, Vincent. Something feels too easy. Feelings are for poets, Arthur, Vincent chuckled, the sound as smooth and empty as polished glass. We deal in facts and figures, and the fact is, this is the cleanest 9-figure land deal in Manhattan history. This was it, now or never. Mia stepped into the circle of light around the table. More coffee, Mr. Sterling? She asked. Her voice was a strained whisper, but in the bubble of self-congratulation, it landed like a dropped plate. All 4 men looked up, their expressions ranging from mild surprise to outright annoyance. Vincent Thorne's perfectly sculpted face tightened into a mask of contempt. A waitress, daring to interrupt. We're fine, he said, his tone sharp and dismissive. He waved a manicured hand at her, a gesture that meant, be gone. Mia ignored him. Her eyes were locked on Arthur Sterling. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice a little stronger now. I'm sorry, my name is Mia. I couldn't help but notice the portfolio. Sterling's gaze sharpened. He was from a different generation. You didn't dismiss people, not even the staff. He just watched her, his expression a flat, unreadable slate. What about it? He asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Her throat felt like it was closing up. The hostile glares of Vincent and the lawyers were physical blows. The photograph, she managed to say, of the first owner, Mr. Moretti, in his glasses. Vincent let out a short, incredulous bark of a laugh. His glasses? What on earth are you talking about? Have you been drinking the leftover wine? Vincent, Sterling said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority that silenced his protege instantly. His eyes remained fixed on Mia. Continue. The world seemed to contract to the space between the old billionaire and the young waitress. There's a reflection, she said, her words coming faster now, in the left lens of his glasses. It's faint, but it's there. It's a man standing in front of him, and the man is wearing a signet ring, a specific one, an Ouroboros, a serpent eating its tail. The silence that descended on the table was absolute, a heavy, suffocating thing. One of the lawyers, the younger one, eager to prove his worth, leaned over the photo with a look of theatrical disbelief. I see. A smudge. A printing artifact. Miss, with all due respect, you're seeing things. No, Mia insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. That was the symbol of the Falcone crime family. Antonio Falcone wore that ring. If he, or one of his men, was there when that photo was taken, it means Mr. Moretti wasn't a willing seller. It means the property was likely taken from him. It means the entire chain of title could be fraudulent. Vincent Thorne finally erupted. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his handsome face contorted with fury. This is the single most absurd, unprofessional, and insane thing I have ever witnessed, He hissed, his voice low but venomous. Arthur, are you really going to allow this nobody to interrupt our celebration with some paranoid fantasy she cooked up from watching too many mob movies? She's probably looking for a handout, a tip. Is that it, sweetheart? You want a big tip for your little story? He reached into his wallet, his movements deliberately insulting. The personal cruelty of the attack was like a slap in the face. Mia felt tears of humiliation spring to her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She held her ground. She had said her piece. She looked away from the snarling face of Vincent Thorne and back to the quiet, assessing gaze of Arthur Sterling. It was his decision now. Sterling didn't look at Vincent. He didn't look at the lawyers. He just looked at Mia. He was a man who had built an empire on his ability to judge character, to see past the polish and look at the grain. He saw her worn-out shoes. He saw the slight tremble in her coffee pot hand. But he also saw the absolute unshakable conviction in her eyes. It was a look he hadn't seen in a very long time, a look of someone speaking an unwelcome truth because they had no other choice. And it contrasted starkly with the sudden, violent defensiveness of Vincent, the man he trusted with everything. His own gut had been screaming at him that something was wrong all night. He made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. "Vincent," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "sit down." "Arthur, I said sit down." Vincent, seething, slowly sank back into his chair, his eyes shooting daggers of pure hatred at Mia. Sterling then turned to the restaurant's maître d', who was hovering nearby, wringing his hands. "Jean-Pierre, my apologies for the disturbance. Would you happen to have a jeweler's loupe or a powerful magnifying glass in your office?" Jean-Pierre blinked, stunned. A loupe, Monsieur Sterling?" "Yes, I believe we do, for inspecting hallmarks on the silver." "Bring it to me, please. Now!" As the maître d' scurried away, Sterling gestured to the empty chair beside him, the one meant for a guest of honor. "Miss Russo," he said, his voice soft, "please, sit." Mia's mind went blank. The entire restaurant seemed to be watching. Vincent looked like he was about to have an apoplexy. With numb, robotic obedience, she placed the coffee pot on a service tray and walked to the chair. She sat, her simple black uniform a stark island of polyester in a sea of bespoke wool and silk. The interruption was over. The trial was about to begin. The atmosphere at Table 7 had shifted from a celebratory banquet to a tense courtroom drama. Mia sat bolt upright in the plush velvet chair, feeling the combined weight of 5 pairs of eyes on her. She was acutely aware of the restaurant manager, Jean-Pierre, returning with a small, powerful magnifying glass on a silver tray, as if presenting a holy relic. He placed it next to Arthur Sterling and retreated, his face a mask of anxious confusion. Vincent Thorne was a coiled spring of rage, his knuckles white where he gripped a steak knife. The 2 lawyers from Sullivan and Cromwell exchanged nervous, bewildered glances, their confidence evaporating under the bizarre turn of events. Arthur Sterling picked up the loupe. He adjusted his reading glasses, then leaned over the open portfolio, his movements slow and deliberate. He positioned the loupe over the left lens of Joseph Moretti's spectacles in the 70-year-old photograph. For a full minute, the only sounds were the distant clatter of cutlery from other tables and the furious, shallow breathing of Vincent Thorne. Mia's heart hammered a frantic beat against her ribs. What if she was wrong? What if it was just a smudge, a trick of the light? The humiliation would be absolute. She would be the crazy waitress who cried wolf. Sterling remained hunched over the image, silent and motionless. Then he let out a long, slow breath. It was not a sigh of dismissal. It was a sound of dawning, sickening realization. He straightened up slowly, placing the loupe carefully on the table. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, his face pale. He didn't look at Mia. He looked directly at Vincent Thorne. "The Ouroboros," Sterling said, his voice a hoarse, hollow whisper. "It's there, clear as day." Vincent's face, which had been flushed with anger, went stark white. "Arthur, it's a coincidence, a shadow. You can't possibly—" "Don't you dare lie to me, Vincent!" Sterling's voice suddenly cracked like a whip, filled with a cold fury that silenced the entire table. Don't you dare think I'm that old, that foolish, that I can't see what's right in front of my face. He tapped the photograph with a trembling finger. This man, Moretti, he looks like my father did the day the bank foreclosed on his hardware store. Proud on the outside, broken on the inside. He's a hostage in his own photograph. He finally turned his gaze to the senior lawyer. Robert, your firm charged me $4 million for the due diligence on this deal. Did you or anyone on your team of 100 associates ever look into the seller, Viridian Assets? The lawyer, a man named Robert Shaw, stammered. We ran the standard corporate searches, Arthur. It's a holding company registered in Delaware. Clean record. Opaque ownership, but that's standard for these types of entities. Opaque, Sterling repeated, the word dripping with sarcasm. How convenient. He turned his Arctic gaze back to Vincent. Viridian Assets. Tell me about them, son. The use of the word son was a deliberate twist of the knife. Vincent swallowed hard, his smooth composure finally cracking, revealing the raw panic underneath. They're a private equity group. They approached us. The price was high, but for this specific parcel for Eleanor Center, we felt it was justified. Who did you deal with? Sterling pressed, his voice like chipping granite. What was his name? A representative. A Mr. Jones, Vincent said, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape that wasn't there. Mr. Jones, Sterling echoed flatly. He sat back in his chair, a look of profound weariness and betrayal settling over his features. He looked like a king who had just discovered the captain of his guard was a paid assassin. Then he did something no one expected. He turned his full attention to Mia, his eyes filled not with suspicion, but with a kind of desperate clarity. Miss Russo, he said, his voice regaining a measure of its command. You study this. You know this history. What does this mean? Tell me what you see. All eyes swiveled to her. She was no longer just the waitress. She was the star witness. She took a steadying breath, Marco's voice in her head telling her to speak the truth plainly. It means that the foundation of this deal, the very first transaction in 1958, was likely illegal, she said, her voice clear and steady. It means the property's title is dirty. Viridian Assets likely knew this. They bought a tainted property, probably for pennies on the dollar, through a series of shell companies to hide its origin. Then they created a new, clean-looking Delaware corporation to sell it to you at a massively inflated price. She paused, then added the final, devastating piece. They weren't just selling you land, Mr. Sterling. They were selling you a future lawsuit, and someone on your side had to make sure your own lawyers never looked deep enough to find it. The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Someone on the inside had steered them toward this specific piece of land. Someone had managed the deal. Someone had overseen the due diligence. Someone had silenced any questions. Every eye at the table, including Arthur Sterling's, slowly turned to the one person who fit that description. Vincent Thorne. The handsome face was now a grotesque mask of sweat and fear. The trap had closed. It's a lie, he shrieked, slamming his fist on the table, making the glasses jump. She's nobody, a waitress with a grudge. You're going to believe her over me? After everything I've done for you? For this company? What you've done for me? Sterling's voice dropped to a terrifying whisper. I gave you everything. My trust, my company, my family's name. And you were going to build my wife's memorial on a pile of filth. You were going to let me pour my heart, my soul, and $250 million into a foundation of lies. He stood up, his aging frame suddenly filled with a formidable, righteous power. The money, I can lose money. But this is a desecration. He pointed a shaking finger at Vincent. You're finished. Get out of my sight before I do something I'll regret. Vincent stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The illusion was shattered. The charming protege was gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate criminal. He shot one last look at Mia, a look of such pure, venomous hatred that she flinched. Then he turned and practically fled from the restaurant, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Arthur Sterling slumped back into his chair, the anger draining out of him, leaving behind a frail, heartbroken old man. The two lawyers sat frozen, their careers flashing before their eyes. Sterling looked across the wreckage of his dinner, his legacy, his trust. His eyes found Mia. He reached into his jacket, his hands shaking, and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. He slid it across the table. It stopped inches from her hand. "My office. Tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "Don't be late." He then looked at his shell-shocked lawyers. "Robert, call security. Freeze all of Thorne's accounts and access privileges. Now, and then be in my office at 8 a.m. with your senior partners. We have work to do." He pushed himself to his feet and walked away without a backward glance, leaving Mia sitting alone at the table, the business card a small, heavy rectangle of destiny on the white linen tablecloth. The next morning, Mia stood before the Sterling Tower on Park Avenue, a soaring edifice of black glass and steel that see. The elevator ascended with the silent, indifferent speed of a guillotine. Mia felt her stomach lurch, a sensation that had nothing to do with the altitude. She was an archivist of the past trespassing in the rarefied air of the future, a ghost in a borrowed blazer walking into the heart of an empire she had just saved and shattered in the same breath. The doors slid open, not into a room, but into a panorama. The city spread out below, a sprawling circuit board of ambition and indifference, viewed from a height that rendered people into abstractions. A woman with a face of serene competence and eyes that had seen decades of corporate wars greeted her. "Miss Russo, I'm Catherine. Mr. Sterling is waiting for you." She led Mia not into the grand office, but to a smaller, more private study adjoining it. The room was lined with dark cherry wood, filled with the scent of old leather and lemon polish. Arthur Sterling was not standing by the window like a triumphant king surveying his domain. He was sitting in a worn leather armchair, a lowball glass of amber liquid untouched on the table beside him. He looked smaller than he had in the restaurant, the formidable power of his anger replaced by the crushing gravity of his grief. The lines on his face were no longer marks of authority, but deep, painful fissures. "Mia," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "thank you for coming. Please sit." She sat opposite him, her hands folded so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the building's climate control. "They spent the night," he began, staring into his glass as if divining a future from the swirling liquid. "Forensic accountants, digital security, men who can peel back the layers of a man's life like an onion. They found everything." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were hollowed-out things. It was worse than a simple fraud. Vincent had been siphoning funds for years, small amounts, untraceable. This was his magnum opus, his grand exit. He leaned forward, the exhaustion in his posture so profound it seemed to ache. He created a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore accounts. He was in business with the descendants of the very filth that stole that land in the first place. "He wasn't just stealing my money, Mia. He was using my wife's memory to launder 70 years of poison. He was going to build her tribute on a mob graveyard and use my grief as the shovel." The self-loathing in his voice was a raw, physical thing. This was a man who had built his life on instinct, on the certainty of his own judgment. That certainty was now a pile of rubble at his feet. A soft chime sounded from the desk intercom. Catherine's voice, calm and even, announced, "Mr. Thorne is here." Mia's blood ran cold. She made a move to stand, to make herself scarce. "I should go." "No," Sterling commanded, his voice suddenly hard as iron. He pressed a button. "Send him in." He looked at Mia. "You started this. You deserve to see how it ends. You need to see the face of what you fought." The door opened. Vincent Thorne walked in, flanked by two immense men in dark suits who were clearly Sterling's security. His bespoke suit was rumpled, his perfect hair was disheveled, and a dark shadow of stubble marred his jawline. But the defiance in his eyes burned brighter than ever. He wasn't repentant. He was furious. He saw Mia and let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Of course, the oracle of the waitstaff. I should have known." He turned his full, venomous attention to Arthur. "So this is it? You're going to destroy a decade of my life, my entire career, based on the paranoid fantasy of a girl who clears breadcrumbs for a living?" "It stopped being a fantasy at around 3 a.m., Arthur said, his voice lethally quiet. When we found the wire transfers from Viridian Assets to a holding company in the Caymans registered in your mother's maiden name. Do you think I'm a fool, Vincent? Yes, Vincent spat, taking a step forward before the guards subtly shifted, blocking his path. Yes, I do. A sentimental old fool, building monuments to the dead while the world moves on. You talk about integrity and handshakes. The world runs on leverage and loopholes. It runs on finding the angle. I learned that from you. You just got too old to see the angles anymore. I gave you a family, Arthur whispered, the words ragged with pain. You gave me a gilded cage, Vincent shot back, his voice rising to a frantic crescendo. You gave me the illusion of power, but it was always your name on the door, your legacy, your rules. You wanted a son, but you didn't want an heir. You wanted a caretaker for your museum. I built this company into what it is today. I doubled its value while you were writing checks for charity. That 100 million? That was my severance, my bonus. The price for 10 years of pretending to be your boy, of listening to your sanctimonious stories about the good old days. I earned it. He looked from Arthur's shattered face to Mia's horrified one. A cruel, knowing smirk twisted his lips. And the best part, the absolute poetry of it, is that I use the one thing you care about more than anything, your precious, sainted Eleanor, to do it, and you never saw a thing. That was the final blow. Arthur Sterling didn't flinch, didn't rage. He simply seemed to deflate, the last bit of fight draining out of him. He looked at the man he had loved like a son, and for the first time, he saw him for what he was, a void, a hollow man filled with nothing but appetite. Get him out of here, Arthur said, his voice barely audible. Turn him over to the district attorney's office. I don't want to see his face ever again. As the guards escorted a still ranting Vincent from the room, Mia sat frozen, the man's poisonous words echoing in the opulent silence. She had seen the ghost in the glass, but he had revealed the rot in the soul. Arthur remained silent for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. He was right about one thing, he finally said, his voice heavy with a terrible clarity. I did get old, not in my body but in my sight. I surrounded myself with men who told me what I wanted to hear. My lawyers saw contracts. My accountants saw ledgers. Vincent saw an opportunity. Not one of them, not one, saw the truth. But you did. He rose from his chair and walked to his desk. He did not pull out a checkbook. He pulled out a blueprint, an old hand-drawn one from decades ago, the paper yellowed and soft at the edges. This was my first project, he said, spreading it out. A small warehouse in Red Hook. I checked every rivet, every joint myself. I knew the name of every man on the crew. I knew the grain of the wood we used for the framing. He looked at her, his eyes searching. I've built 100 skyscrapers since then, Mia, and I've lost the ability to see the grain of the wood. I've been looking at the skyline, not the foundation. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. I am going to take care of your grandfather. That is not a transaction. It is a debt of honor to another honest craftsman. I am going to fund your education, all of it. That is not a reward. It is a restoration of what was stolen from you by circumstance. He paused, leaning on the desk, his gaze intense. But what I want to offer you is not charity. It's a job, a partnership. Vincent created a new department in this company without my knowledge. The Department of Corruption. I'm going to create another. I'm founding the Sterling Archives, a place where every document, every deal, every partnership this company has ever engaged in and ever will is stored and examined. Not just for legal compliance, but for ethical integrity, for the truth. And I want you to run it. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Me, sir? I'm just a student. I only saw... You saw what my $4 million legal team missed, he interrupted, his voice firm. You saw what my own chosen successor was hiding in plain sight. You have the two things I now realize are the most valuable assets on earth, an eye for the truth and the courage to speak it. All the other skills, the degrees, the corporate nonsense, that can be taught. Courage cannot. He saw the fear and doubt in her eyes. I'm not asking you to be an executive, Mia. I'm asking you to be a guardian. My conscience, your only duty will be to me. Your only mandate will be to look at the details everyone else dismisses and tell me what you see. To find the ghosts in the glass before they become monsters in the boardroom. The scale of it was terrifying, overwhelming. It was a weight she couldn't imagine bearing. But then she thought of Marco, of his gnarled, useless hands that had once built such beautiful things. She thought of his unwavering belief in the simple, profound power of the truth. This wasn't just a job offer. It was the culmination of everything he had ever taught her. "When do I start?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A year passed. It was a year of profound transformation, lived in two different worlds. By day, Mia was immersed in her studies, the abstract theories of archival science and forensic history, now imbued with the thrilling, terrifying weight of reality. She was not merely a student. She was a smith, forging the tools she would need for the rest of her life. By night and on weekends, she was in a quiet, climate-controlled office Sterling had set up for her on a lower floor of the tower, a space that was slowly becoming the Sterling Archives. She began with the past, painstakingly digitizing and cross-referencing 70 years of company history, building a searchable, ethical map of an empire. Arthur never rushed her. He gave her space, resources, and, most importantly, his unwavering trust. Her greatest transformation, however, took place in a sun-drenched room in a quiet care facility upstate. Marco Russo, freed from the crushing anxiety of cost, began to thrive. The physical therapist worked miracles, but the true healing came from the peace in his mind. He couldn't hold a chisel anymore, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. When Mia visited, she wouldn't talk about the corporate intrigue. She would show him photographs of old buildings, of intricate joinery, of forgotten architectural details. He would tap a gnarled finger on a picture, a flicker of the old master in his eyes, and she would understand. He was still teaching her how to see. Her first real test came 6 months in. Sterling was considering a partnership to build a massive desalination plant in a developing country. The deal was lauded by everyone. It was green, it was humanitarian, it was profitable. The legal, financial, and environmental reports were flawless. Arthur sent the entire 1,000-page prospectus to her office with a simple note. "What do you see?" Mia spent a week reading. She saw nothing but a perfect deal. On the last day, frustrated, she was about to admit defeat when she remembered Marco's lesson. Look past the polish. She stopped reading the reports and started looking at the metadata of the digital files. She examined the geological surveys, the satellite images, the appendices no one ever reads. And there, buried in an appendix of an appendix, was a single low-resolution satellite photo from a decade prior. It showed the proposed coastal site. A small fishing village was clearly visible. In the current proposal's pristine images, the village was gone. She dug deeper, using her archival research skills to scour local news archives, NGO reports, anything she could find. She pieced together a ghost story. The village had been quietly and forcibly relocated by the local government, a partner in the deal, 2 years earlier, to clear the way for future development. The villagers were moved to a barren inland location with no access to the sea that was their livelihood. The flawless environmental report had been commissioned after the village was erased. She brought her findings to Arthur. She didn't present a conclusion, just the facts. 2 satellite photos, side by side, and a collection of translated articles from a forgotten local newspaper. He looked at the images for a long time, his face grim. He picked up the phone. "Kill the Aquagen deal," he said without preamble. "All of it, and quietly funnel $5 million through our philanthropic arm to the aid group supporting the families of the Arasai village." He hung up and looked at Mia, a look of profound respect in his eyes. The ghost this time wasn't in a man's glasses. It was in the land itself. The day finally came for the new groundbreaking. The site was a former industrial wasteland on the Brooklyn waterfront, a place of rust and ruin that Sterling Enterprises had spent a year remediating, cleaning the poison from the soil. It was symbolic, a new foundation on cleansed ground. Mia stood beside Arthur, the spring breeze whipping off the river. A sign announced the future home of the Eleanor Sterling Center for Neurological Advancement. Below it, Arthur had added another line, the Marco Russo Center for Applied Craft and Integrity. A place for the mind, And a place for the hands, Arthur said, following her gaze. It occurred to me that my wife spent her life fighting a disease that stole memory, while your grandfather spent his life building things that were meant to last for generations. They were fighting the same enemy, time. It seems only right they should fight it together. He looked out at the city skyline, the monument to his life's work. I spent 50 years building things that touch the sky, he mused. But you taught me that the only legacy that matters is one with a foundation that can withstand the truth. Mia looked from the old Titan beside her to the clean, waiting earth. She thought of the ghost in the photograph, that tiny flicker of a long-forgotten crime that had changed everything. It had not been an ending. It had been an opening, a key unlocking a door into her own future. She was no longer the invisible girl clearing tables. She was an archivist of truth, a guardian of the grain. She was home, and her work was just beginning.